Poliomyelitis, which is also known as polio, what is it and how bad is it? Polio is a virus that survives in a person's digestive system, particularly in the large intestine. 90 to 95% of the time, it's harmless and people experience no symptoms at all. But for the other 5 to 10% of people, the virus spreads from the digestive system to the nervous system. The virus then interferes with their nerves and can interfere with their ability to control their muscles, like in their arms or their legs. Sometimes it can also affect a person's diaphragm, which is the muscle that helps control our lungs pull in and push out air. This would require patients to be put in a machine called an iron lung, which is a type of ventilator that creates a negative pressure to help you pull air into your lungs. In some cases with polio, the damage is irreversible. Quite grim, I know, but that's why this virus is so scary. Needless to say, if you were a parent from around 1909 to 1957, it would be a stressful time to be alive. But why then? The Industrial Revolution. Polio is believed to have been around for thousands of years. The virus spreads from a person's saliva or their fecal matter, their poop, if you will. The Industrial Revolution brought people from farms into the city for work, so they lived in really close quarters. And they didn't have great infrastructure back then, especially with the sewage system. Human waste was being dumped into the same water sources where drinking water was being pulled from. As you can imagine, the number of cases exploded, and in 1916 in New York, there were thousands of cases, 2,000 of which were fatal. Efforts in beating the virus. So prior to becoming president, Franklin D. Roosevelt became paralyzed from the waist down. People at the time thought it was polio, but some people today think it's Guillain disease. Nonetheless, FDR's name became associated with polio. He tried many treatments, and eventually he opened a rehab center for polio patients. He had a friend named Basil O'Connor, who he worked with to establish the National Foundation of Infantile Paralysis, which later changed its name to the March of Dimes. Fun fact, it still exists today. They work to improve the health of mothers and babies, and it all started with polio. O'Connor launched a campaign where instead of asking the rich for donations, he asked school children to send in dimes to support their friends and classmates who had polio. The White House received tens of thousands of letters from children across the country. This was the first crowd-funded charitable campaign. The donations were used to fund therapy, treatments, and equipment like the iron lung for polio victims. The March of Dimes was so successful that in the 1950s, 80% of polio victims received funds from the March of Dimes. Franklin D. Roosevelt died in 1945 before he could see the end of polio. Because of his association with the March of Dimes and the fight against the polio virus, we can still find his face minted on the US dime today. A cure in sight. Dr. Jonas Salk had an idea for a vaccine. He had a small research lab at the University of Pittsburgh, and he wanted help from the March of Dimes. Dr. Salk proposed making an inactivated vaccine, which is a dead virus vaccine. At the time, most vaccines were attenuated, which means they use a live version of the virus, but they change it a little bit so that it's not harmful. Salk had previously worked on a successful inactivated virus vaccine against influenza and wanted to do the same for polio. But some people from the science community called Dr. Salk crazy. O'Connor still worked with Salk though, because he wanted a treatment that was available to the public as soon as possible. A year or so later, Salk's vaccine was successful in animal trials, so the obvious next step was to test it in humans. Salk tested the vaccine on himself, his kids, a group of children, and nobody got polio. The following year, they tried it in even more people, up until the Francis Field trial in 1954. 1.8 million children participated in the US, Canada, and Finland. The trial took 1 year, and the whole world waited impatiently. On April 12, 1955, the vaccine was declared to be safe. This date was special because it was the 10th anniversary of the death of President Roosevelt. A scandal. In 1955, there was a batch of the vaccine that was made from a lab with the live polio virus, and it infected hundreds of children. This shed light on the fact that the government wasn't involved in regulating the production of this vaccine, and this had to change. This bad batch of the vaccine gave power to the FDA to regulate the vaccine, and the quality of the vaccine was never questioned again. Another vaccine. Who remembers the vaccine on the sugar cube? In 1961, Dr. Albert Sabin made an oral vaccine that used a live version of the virus. His version of the vaccine was much cheaper to make and quickly replaced Salk's. In the year 1961, there were as few as 161 recorded cases of polio. Together, the two doctors eradicated polio around the world. And neither of them patented their vaccines. This gave access to their vaccines to billions of people. Real heroes. The aftermath. The special wards for polio patients eventually became the intensive care units that we have today. Polio has advanced our world of physical therapy and gave rise to the regulation of vaccine through government organizations like the FDA. Today, the FDA helps regulate the COVID-19 vaccines. Finally, many polio victims grew up with disabilities and found a world that was made only for the able-bodied. They themselves brought the changes that made our public spaces more accessible. My name is Dr. Anna Blakeney and I'm an RNA researcher, so if you like this video, subscribe. I like talking about vaccines, and some call me the vaccine queen. Mostly me, but sometimes other people.